And then there's one other character. Well, she's not exactly a person. Andreas is the only person who knows who she is. Listen to the voice and try to think what it reminds you of.
Hallo. Hallo. Da bin ich.
Does it remind you, perhaps, of a computer voice? Could it be the voice of a genie? Or of an elf? Well, let's just say she's an imaginary figure. She can speak and understand German. And although she's invisible, her voice can be heard loud and clear. Of course, this is a situation she enjoys taking advantage of, much to Andreas's dismay. How did she meet Andreas? Well, that's another story, and we'll tell you more about that in Lesson 8. At this point, let it suffice to say that she's called Ex, which in Latin means out of. It's a name Andreas thought up. So now you're familiar with all the main characters in the story.
Ich und Andreas und Frau Berger und Hanna und Dr. Thürmann.
Well, Dr. Thürmann is quite taken aback. He repeats what Ex said because he can't believe that he's been addressed so informally as du.
Und wer bist du?
Du? Und wer bist du?
All Andreas can do to save the situation is apologize.
Entschuldigung. Entschuldigung.
But to come back to Andreas and Dr. Thürmann, their conversation continues. Dr. Thürmann takes a large sip of beer and then says to Andreas,
Sie sind wohl ein Witzbold.
Dr. Thürmann thinks that Andreas has been playing a practical joke on him. He says Andreas is a bit of a joker and calls him a Wizbold, a term usually used for someone who makes bad jokes. At this point, Ex, the invisible elf, pipes up and makes a pun in German. She says she isn't a Wizbold, but a Kobold, an elf, which all adds to the general confusion. Listen to the end of the conversation. Why does Dr. Thürmann decide not to pursue it?
Sie sind wohl ein Witzbold.
Witzbold?
Nein, ein Kobold. Ich bin ein Kobold.
Ach, was? Ein Kobold oder ein Witzbold oder... Ich bin müde. Gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht, Herr Dr. Thürmann.
Andreas takes this opportunity to tell Ex that it's very impolite to address strangers in the du form.
Ex? Ex.
Ja, bitte?
Also, du bist unhöflich.
Ich? Unhöflich?
Ja, du.
Entschuldigung, ich...
Das ist doch unhöflich.
Und wer bist du? Ich bin müde.
Nein, du bist ein Kobold.
Ex pretends that she's upset by what Andreas says. He calls her an elf. But who knows whether that's meant as a compliment or as a criticism. Well, that's all for today. Goodbye for now, and do join us for the next lesson.
Gute Nacht.
Ex is an elf, and so she spends her time studying people, that is, humans. Andreas tells Dr. Thürmann that he's studying, and Ex tells Andreas that she is doing the same thing.
Ich studiere.
Andreas is surprised to hear this. He asks again to make sure he's understood correctly. I beg your pardon? Studying?
Wie bitte? Studieren?
Ex says yes. But she and Andreas are studying different subjects. Andreas is studying journalism at a university. X, meanwhile, says she is studying people. Listen again.
Ja, ich mache Studien. Ich studiere Menschen.
This makes Andreas pause to think, because he's interested in people too. That's why he writes articles. After a brief pause, Andreas tells X that she's strange, seltsam. Listen to X's reply. What does she say?
Ach, du bist seltsam.
Menschen sind auch seltsam.
X says she thinks people are strange as well. Auch. Andreas finds this an interesting idea. He hasn't got much work to do at the moment, so he puts on his favourite cassette, quietly of course, and reflects on the human condition. In a philosophic vein, he begins by asking himself questions. What are human beings like? His question in German begins with the word wie. X has already reached her conclusion. Listen to their conversation. What does X say about human beings?
Menschen. Der Mensch. Wie ist der Mensch?
Unhöflich, müde, interessant und seltsam.
Wie bitte? Was?
Der Mensch ist unhöflich, müde, sehr interessant, seltsam und neugierig.
That's how X views human beings, and she finishes by saying they are inquisitive, neugierig. Once again, Andreas asks, what are human beings like?
Wie ist der Mensch?
X lists all their possible qualities, from impolite to strange.
Unhöflich, müde, interessant und seltsam.
Andreas is lost in his own thoughts, so when he hears X's voice, he jumps. I beg your pardon, he says. What?
Wie bitte? Was?
X finishes by saying human beings are inquisitive, neugierig.
Der Mensch ist unhöflich, müde, sehr interessant, seltsam und neugierig.
And that's certainly one quality that X has. Two of the guests have just realized that they both come, common, from the same city, Augsburg, in South Germany. They asked each other questions beginning with woher? Where from? When X hears this, she decides to ask Andreas where he comes from. Andreas is at the reception desk, and he isn't very busy, so X can ask her question right away.
Andreas, woher kommst du?
Ich komme aus Köln. Und du? Woher kommst du?
Ich komme aus...
Andreas comes from Cologne. It's a long story, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Perhaps you noticed that X is rather embarrassed because Andreas has asked her where she comes from. Andreas did it to tease X. He knew that this question would make her feel awkward. To understand this, we have to tell you the story of how X got to know Andreas. One night, Andreas was sitting at home, enjoying one of his favourite pastimes, reading. He was reading a book about his hometown, Cologne, and one of the famous legends that surrounds the city. The Heinzelmännchen, little elf-like figures, used to come out at night and help the craftsmen finish their work. While the craftsmen slept, the Heinzelmännchen finished building Cologne Cathedral. They baked the bread for the baker, they slaughtered the pig for the butcher, they helped the tailor by finishing sewing the suit of clothes for the Lord Mayor. They were always busy, much to the delight of the people of Cologne. Andreas finished reading the story and gave a deep sigh. I could do with some help too, but those times are obviously over.
Ich möchte auch. Naja, das ist sowieso vorbei.
Andreas hadn't quite finished making his wish when he suddenly noticed a strange noise.
Hallo? Hallo? Da bin ich.
Wer bist du?
Ich bin,
Wer bist du?
ich bin ich.
It was X, the invisible elf. Andreas called her X, which means out of in Latin, because she jumped out of his book. But there's something Andreas doesn't know. X only jumped out of the book because Andreas said the magic word sowieso, which means obviously or in any case. And from then on, X was Andreas's constant companion, whether he liked it or not. If you remember, in the last program we revealed the secret of how X and Andreas got to know one another. Andreas was sitting at home enjoying his favourite pastime, reading. He was reading a book about the Heinzelmännchen in Cologne. Legend has it that these elf-like figures would come out at night and help the craftsmen finish their work. Andreas wished that someone would help him with his work. Then suddenly he heard this strange voice.
Hallo? Hallo? Da bin ich.
Wer bist du?
Ich bin ich.
It was an invisible elf. Andreas called her X, which in Latin means out of, because she jumped out of his book. And now she's Andreas's constant companion, whether he likes it or not. X, as you may have already noticed, is very inquisitive, and she's managed to persuade Andreas to look up the hotel register to find out as much as they can about one of the guests, Dr. Thürmann. When guests register at a hotel, they have to fill in a form with their first name, surname, profession, and so on. But X and Andreas don't get very far. They start talking about names, and Andreas teases X about her name. Listen to their conversation and try and work out why X is annoyed.
Hier. Also, Name Thürmann.
Das weiß ich doch. Weiter.
Vorname Lukas.
Vorname?
Ja, Vorname.
Wie ist dein Vorname?
Das weißt du doch. Andreas. Und dein Vorname?
Das weiß ich nicht.
Aber ich weiß das. Vorname X, Name Hex.
Nein. Nein.
X is annoyed because Andreas has thought up a surname for her. He calls her Hex, which means a witch, because it rhymes with her first name, X. Listen again. Andreas asks X her first name, Vorname.
Und dein Vorname?
Elves don't usually have names, so X says, I don't know.
Das weiß ich nicht.
Andreas says that he does. I do. I know, he says.
Aber ich weiß das.
He says her first name is X, and her surname, Name, is Hex.
Vorname X, Name Hex.
X objects to this, understandably. Did you notice that X was very impatient at the beginning of the conversation? This was because Andreas had told her something she already knew. I already know that, she says.
Das weiß ich doch.
This is exactly what Andreas said to her when she asked him his first name. You already know that.
Das weißt du doch.
It's evening and Andreas is sitting at the reception desk of the Hotel Europa. He's quite content just to do a few administrative tasks. But X decides to bombard Andreas with questions. She asks, among other things, if Andreas is happy. Glücklich. How does Andreas react? And how does he reply to this question?
Du? Andreas? Arbeitest du?
Ja,
Du? Andreas? Arbeitest du viel?
ja.
Andreas? Bist du glücklich? Was heißt Ja oder nein?
Fragst du immer so viel?
Immer.
Psst, da kommt jemand.
When X asks Andreas if he's happy, Andreas mutters an answer and asks X if she always asks so much. Then X asks Andreas if he works a lot. Viel.
Du? Andreas? Arbeitest du viel?
And then X asks Andreas directly, Andreas, are you happy?
Du? Andreas? Bist du glücklich?
Andreas doesn't know whether to answer yes or no, so he says, Immediately, X asks him what means. Does it mean yes or no?
Was heißt Ja oder nein?
Andreas evades this question, and instead of answering, he asks X a question. He uses the words to ask, fragen, and always, immer, and says, Do you always ask so much?
Fragst du immer so viel?
X says she always does. Their questions would have continued if someone, jemand, hadn't entered the hotel. Andreas is relieved.
Psst, da kommt jemand.
X, as you know, is an invisible elf, and she was making the most of this situation. Hannah was startled to hear a voice, apparently coming from nowhere. So she asked, Is anyone there?
Ist da jemand?
Frau Berger, the hotel manageress, happened to be passing the room and heard Hannah talking to someone. She also heard X's voice and said to herself, That's funny.
Komisch.
X is, of course, invisible, and this adds to the general confusion. Meanwhile, Andreas is at the reception desk. He suddenly notices that X has disappeared and realizes that this is a bad sign. He goes looking for her, and then he hears her voice.
Was ist komisch?
Perhaps you can imagine how Andreas feels. He'll appear on the scene alone, allein, but the people around him will hear two voices. Listen to the following conversation and note the word for we, wir. How can you tell that Andreas is confused?
Komisch.
Was ist komisch?
Ist da jemand?
Ja, wir.
Psst, sei doch still.
Was machen Sie denn hier?
Wir studieren.
Wie bitte?
Ja, nein, also wir... Ich bin nur neugierig.
Interessant. Sagen Sie mal, Sie sind doch allein. Sagen Sie immer wir und meinen ich?
As you no doubt heard, Andreas can't conceal his confusion. He begins to stutter. Listen again. X wants to find out what Frau Berger finds funny.
Was ist komisch?
Frau Berger asks if anyone is there, and X replies, Yes, we are.
Ist da jemand?
Ja, wir.
Andreas tries, without success, to silence X.
Psst, sei doch still.
But Frau Berger has noticed Andreas. She asks him what he's doing here.
Was machen Sie denn hier?
Before Andreas can answer, X replies, "We're studying."
Wir studieren.
Hannah laughs and says, "I beg your pardon."
Was machen Sie denn hier?
Wir studieren.
Wie bitte?
Andreas doesn't know whether to say I or we. But before he can reply, Frau Berger asks him directly whether he always says we, wir, when he means I, ich.
Sagen Sie immer wir und meinen ich?
There you heard the personal pronouns ich and the plural equivalent wir. Listen once again.
Sagen Sie immer wir und meinen ich?
Frau Berger is, understandably, surprised. She can't see X, but she can hear a strange voice. The conversation continues. Listen and try to get the gist, even if you don't understand every single word. Hannah and Andreas talk about their work, but Hannah is confused. Why?
Sagen Sie immer wir und meinen ich?
Nein, natürlich nicht.
Sie sind neu hier, oder? Ich glaube, Sie sind der Portier.
Stimmt.
Und warum sagen Sie, wir studieren?
Ich bin Student.
Was denn? Student oder Portier?
Student und Portier.
Ach so. Naja, also ich bin Hanna, das Zimmermädchen.
Und ich bin Andreas.
Also, an die Arbeit.
Okay, tschüss.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao, bambina.
Hannah is confused because Andreas says he's a student, although he's just told her that he's the hotel porter. Listen again. Hannah says she thinks Andreas is the porter.
Ich glaube, Sie sind der Portier.
Andreas says he is, indeed, the hotel porter. Hannah then asks why Andreas says, "We are studying."
Warum sagen Sie, wir studieren?
And when Andreas tells her that he's a student, Hannah is thoroughly confused. Finally, she asks him what he is, a student oder a porter.
Was denn? Student oder Portier?
Andreas answers, quite truthfully, that he's both. He tells her he's a student and a porter.
Student und Portier.
Hannah introduces herself and says she's the hotel chambermaid, Zimmermädchen.
Na ja, also ich bin Hanna, das Zimmermädchen.
Frau Berger has heard this conversation and she's amused, but she tells Andreas and Hannah that it's time to get back to work.
Also, an die Arbeit.
Hannah says goodbye to Andreas. She says tschüss, which is the informal way of saying goodbye to someone. And X replies, just as casually, by saying ciao.
Okay, tschüss.
Ciao.
This brings us to the last scene in the hotel. X, the invisible elf, thinks Andreas has been neglecting her, and she demands his attention. To make her presence felt, X starts playing around with various things at the reception desk, including Andreas's fountain pen, Füller. As you may have noticed, Andreas and X address one another informally. They call each other do. The possessive article in the second person do form is dein before masculine and neuter nouns and deine before feminine nouns. Listen to the conversation between Andreas and X.
Das ist mein Füller.
Dein Füller? Ach so, das weiß ich doch nicht. Ist das auch deine Brille?
Nein, Ex, sei still, ich arbeite.
Arbeiten, arbeiten. Der Mensch arbeitet immer.
Next, Andreas asks his parents if they're planning a visit. You will come to Aachen, won't you?
Ihr kommt doch nach Aachen?
X is sitting quietly, listening to Andreas. She isn't sure who Andreas wants to come to visit, so she asks, who exactly?
Wer denn?
And Andreas replies, my parents.
Meine Eltern.
Of course, it was obvious who Andreas was writing to, but X just wanted to get Andreas's attention. Listen to the conversation between Andreas and X. What does X want, and why does she want to get Andreas's attention?
Und ich? Wo steht, Ex ist meine Freundin?
Ach so, du meinst...
Ja.
Ach, Ex, das geht doch nicht.
Warum nicht?
X thinks Andreas should mention her in his letter to his parents. She wants him to tell them that she is his girlfriend, Freundin. So she asks, where does it say, X is my girlfriend?
Und ich? Wo steht, Ex ist meine Freundin?
What can Andreas say? He tries to explain to X that that's not possible.
Ach, Ex, das geht doch nicht.
But X is persistent. She asks, why not?
Warum nicht?
Andreas doesn't reply because it would be too difficult to explain, so he signs off his letter.
Bis bald, euer Andreas.
Andreas has the weekend off. He's at home and he's sorting out old things, Sachen, that he no longer needs. Clothes, books, records, and so on. He wants to sell these belongings at the flea market, Flohmarkt. Listen to the conversation between Andreas and X. Andreas is busy sorting out things he wants to sell, verkaufen. X is looking on. Andreas makes fun of X. What does he threaten to do to her?
Warum liegen die Sachen da?
Ich verkaufe sie.
Was? Verkaufen? Wo denn?
Morgen ist Flohmarkt.
Flohmarkt? Flohmarkt? Verkaufst du Flöhe?
Nein, ich verkaufe die Ex-Hex.
Nein, bitte nicht.
Andreas threatens to sell X along with his belongings. Of course, he's only teasing her. To begin with, X asks Andreas why so many of his things, Sachen, are lying around.
Warum liegen die Sachen da?
Andreas says he's spread out his belongings because he wants to sell them.
Ich verkaufe sie.
X is surprised at this. She asks Andreas where, wo, he wants to sell his old belongings. She says, what? Sell them? Where?
Was? Verkaufen? Wo denn?
Aachen, like many other German cities, has a regular flea market, Flohmarkt. Andreas explains to X, tomorrow there's a flea market.
Morgen ist Flohmarkt.
X has never heard of a flea market before, and she thinks it's a market where fleas, Flöhe, are sold. So she asks Andreas, are you going to sell fleas?
Verkaufst du Flöhe?
These markets are called flea markets because they sell everything, even things that are as small as a flea. X is also very small, and so Andreas teases her by saying he'll try to sell her too. He makes a rhyme, saying, I'll sell X, the witch.
Ich verkaufe die Ex-Hex.
X is horrified at this thought, and so she begs Andreas, no, please don't.
Nein, bitte nicht.
Once X realizes there's no danger that Andreas will sell her at the flea market, she continues to pester him. She looks through all the things he wants to sell and finds, for example, cassettes, Kassetten, and records, Schallplatten. Listen to their conversation again. What does Andreas want to sell? And what is he uncertain about selling? Listen out for the word nicht, which negates a verb.
Verkaufst du auch die Kassetten?
Ja, sie sind alt. Ich höre sie doch nicht.
Und die Schallplatten? Verkaufst du auch die Schallplatten?
Ich weiß nicht. Ich glaube nicht.
Sind sie neu?
Nein, natürlich nicht.
Spielst du eine Schallplatte?
Na gut.
Wenn bei Capri die rote Sonne im Meer versieht und vom Himmel die bleiche Sichel des Mondes blinkt.
Andreas wants to sell his cassettes, but he's not sure whether he should also sell his records. Listen again. X asks him, are you selling the cassettes too?
Verkaufst du auch die Kassetten?
Andreas wants to sell them because they're old. Yes, he says, they're old.
Ja, sie sind alt.
He also wants to sell them because he doesn't listen to them anymore.
Ich höre sie doch nicht.
X asks about the records, Schallplatten. What about the records, she asks. Are you selling the records too?
Und die Schallplatten? Verkaufst du auch die Schallplatten?
Andreas hasn't made his mind up. I don't know, he says. I don't think so.
Ich weiß nicht. Ich glaube nicht.
X asks Andreas if the records are new.
Sind sie neu?
They aren't new. Andreas says, no, of course not.
Nein, natürlich nicht.
X would like to hear a record. She asks Andreas, will you put a record on?
Spielst du eine Schallplatte?
Andreas agrees to do so and says, well, okay.
Na gut.
But at that moment, Frau Berger discovers a book, Buch, she's been looking for a long time. Then X interrupts. Listen and try to find out why.
Oh, das ist ja toll. Genau das Buch suche ich.
Zeigen Sie mal. Ach, die Heinzelmännchen.
Was kostet es?
1 Mark.
Gut, ich nehme es.
Nein, das Buch verkaufst du nicht.
Wie bitte?
Tja, Entschuldigung, Frau Berger. Ich verkaufe es doch nicht. Entschuldigung.
Und warum liegt das Buch dann da? Na, dann tschüss.
Ex, was ist?
Das ist doch unser Buch. Ich liebe es.
X wants to prevent Andreas from selling the book, which is about the Heinzelmännchen in Cologne. If you remember, this book tells a story of the elf-like figures who, according to legend, used to come out at night in Cologne and help the craftsmen finish their work. Andreas was reading the book one evening when suddenly X leapt out from its pages. Listen again. Frau Berger is delighted to have found the book. Oh, she says, that's wonderful.
Oh, das ist ja toll.
She tells Andreas that this is exactly, genau, the book she's been looking for.
Genau das Buch suche ich.
Andreas doesn't realize which book she means, so he says, "Show me."
Zeigen Sie mal.
He realizes that she means the book about the Heinzelmännchen.
Ach, die Heinzelmännchen.
Frau Berger asks how much it costs.
Was kostet es?
The book only costs 1 mark. Eine Mark.
Eine Mark.
Frau Berger doesn't hesitate for a moment. Fine, she says. I'll take it.
Gut, ich nehme es.
At that moment, X interrupts the conversation. No, she says to Andreas, you mustn't sell that book.
Nein, das Buch verkaufst du nicht.
In order to avoid any more questions, Andreas turns to Frau Berger and says he's sorry, but he's not selling the book.
Tja, Entschuldigung, Frau Berger. Ich verkaufe es doch nicht.
Frau Berger is annoyed. Then why is the book on display, she asks.
Warum liegt das Buch dann da?
Frau Berger says goodbye to Andreas and walks away. Andreas turns to X and asks her what is wrong.
Ex, was ist?
X reminds Andreas that the book about the Heinzelmännchen is very important. That's our book, she says.
Das ist doch unser Buch.
X tells Andreas that she doesn't want him to sell the book because she loves it.
Ich liebe es.
Meanwhile, X has been looking round the flea market and she's noticed something which is typically German. She's found a garden gnome, Gartenzwerg. Garden gnomes are usually made of plastic or ceramics. They always have red caps, red cheeks, a long white beard, and in most cases they're pushing a wheelbarrow. X, as you know, is an elf and is delighted to meet her own kind.
Andreas, schau mal, ein Kobold.
Nein, Ex. Das ist ein Gartenzwerg.
Wie bitte?
Weißt du, die Deutschen finden Gartenzwerge toll.
Ich auch. Bitte, ich möchte auch.
Ach, Ex.
X asks Andreas to buy a garden gnome, but Andreas isn't very keen on this idea. And now let's continue with the story. It's Monday morning, the weekend is over, and Andreas has to go back to work. He's just had a quick breakfast and he's about to leave the house to go, fahren, to the Hotel Europa. Listen to the conversation between X and Andreas. What sort of mood are they in?
Ex, ich fahre jetzt. Kommst du?
Ich habe keine Lust.
Okay, du hast keine Lust und ich habe keine Zeit. Dann bleib zu Hause. Tschüss.
Andreas, bitte warte doch. Ich komme ja.
As you could probably tell from the tone of their voices, X doesn't feel like doing anything, and Andreas is irritated. He isn't in the mood to have a long discussion with X, and he tells her to stay at home. Listen again. First, Andreas says, X, I'm going now.
Ex, ich fahre jetzt.
X doesn't reply, so Andreas asks, Are you coming?
Kommst du?
This time X replies to Andreas and says, I don't feel like it.
Ich habe keine Lust.
By now, Andreas is becoming impatient. Okay, he says, you don't feel like it, and I have no time.
Okay, du hast keine Lust und ich habe keine Zeit.
Andreas is in a hurry to get to work. He doesn't want to waste any more time, and so he says, then stay at home.
Dann bleib zu Hause.
Andreas knows that X doesn't want to do that either. She pleads with him to wait.
Andreas, bitte warte doch.
And then she adds, I'm coming.
Ich komme ja.
Meanwhile, X is sitting beside Andreas at the reception desk. Andreas has finished his work and is reading something. But X won't leave him in peace. Listen to their conversation. It has something to do with seeing, sehen, and not seeing, nicht sehen.
Andreas, was machst du?
Lesen.
Was liest du?
Ich lese ein Buch. Das siehst du doch.
Ich sehe nichts. Ich sehe gar nichts. Ich bin unsichtbar und sehe nichts.
Ex sieht nichts und stört viel.
X maintains that she can't see anything. Listen once again. X asks Andreas what he's doing. He answers her in one word, reading.
Lesen.
X isn't satisfied with this answer, so she asks, What are you reading?
Was liest du?
Andreas answers impatiently that he's reading a book.
Ich lese ein Buch.
And because he doesn't want to be disturbed by any more questions, he adds, You can see that.
Das siehst du doch.
X replies that she can see nothing, nichts. And because she's feeling a little annoyed, she goes further and says she can see nothing at all, gar nichts.
Ich sehe nichts. Ich sehe gar nichts.
She says this is because she's invisible, unsichtbar.
Ich bin unsichtbar und sehe nichts.
Andreas knows perfectly well that X is invisible, but he also knows that she can see perfectly. Andreas says that X may not be able to see, but she's disturbing him. Sie stört.
Ex sieht nichts und stört viel.
But even this doesn't silence her. X says she's hungry, and before he knows where he is, Andreas is going out to eat, essen, with X and Frau Berger. Listen to the conversation. How does this come about?
So, fertig.
Au, mein Bauch tut weh.
Ex, was ist?
Ich habe Hunger.
Ex hat Hunger?
Sowieso.
Ich habe auch Hunger.
Guten Abend, Frau Berger.
Gehen wir zusammen essen?
Das ist eine gute Idee. Aber sagen Sie mal, wer spricht da? Ich sehe nur Sie.
Ich bin doch Bauchredner.
Ach was.
Aber das ist mein Geheimnis.
Los geht's!
As you heard, X says she's hungry. At that moment, Frau Berger comes to the reception desk and says that she's hungry too. Listen to the conversation once again. Andreas has just finished reading his book and is about to go home. There. Finished, he says.
So. Fertig.
X says she has tummy ache.
Au, mein Bauch tut weh.
And then she explains that she's hungry.
Ich habe Hunger.
Frau Berger hears this and says she's hungry too.
Ich habe auch Hunger.
But before Andreas has a chance to say anything, X says, "Shall we all go out to eat?"
Gehen wir zusammen essen?
Frau Berger assumes that she's included in the invitation and replies, "That's a good idea."
Das ist eine gute Idee.
Frau Berger has noticed a strange voice whenever she talks to Andreas, and she wants to know what it is. She can't, of course, see X because she's invisible. She asks, "Who's that speaking?"
Wer spricht da?
Turning to Andreas, she says, "I can only see you."
Ich sehe nur Sie.
You know how Andreas and X got to know each other. But how can Andreas try to explain that X is an elf who jumped out of a book he was reading? He suddenly has an idea and says, "I'm a ventriloquist."
Ich bin doch Bauchredner.
But then he adds quickly that that is his secret, Geheimnis.
Aber das ist mein Geheimnis.
And before Frau Berger has time to think about this, X says, "Let's go."
Los geht's!
Andreas, X and Frau Berger are now sitting in an Italian restaurant. It's a pizzeria. These restaurants are very popular in Germany because the food is usually very good and it's not too expensive. Frau Berger looks at the menu and decides to have salad for a starter and then fish for the main course. Andreas chooses a pizza. Frau Berger can't, of course, see X because she's invisible, but she can hear her voice, Stimme, and she's puzzled. Listen to the conversation.
Was möchten Sie denn essen?
Zuerst einen Salat und dann Fisch. Und Sie? Was essen Sie?
Eine Pizza mit Schinken, Käse und Tomaten.
So viel?
Da ist sie ja wieder, Ihre zweite Stimme.
Ja, sie ist ziemlich frech.
Frau Berger thinks that Andreas is putting on a funny voice, and she's amused. Listen again. To begin with, Andreas asks Frau Berger what she'd like to eat.
Was möchten Sie denn essen?
Frau Berger chooses salad, Salat. To start with, a salad, she says.
Zuerst einen Salat.
And then she'd like fish.
Und dann Fisch.
Frau Berger asks Andreas what he's going to eat.
Und Sie? Was essen Sie?
Andreas decides to have a pizza with ham, cheese and tomatoes.
Eine Pizza mit Schinken, Käse und Tomaten.
When X hears what Andreas is ordering, she says, "So much?"
So viel?
Frau Berger hears this and says to Andreas, "There it is again, your second voice."
Da ist sie ja wieder, ihre zweite Stimme.
Andreas has to think of something to say, and so he replies, "Yes, it's rather cheeky."
Ja, sie ist ziemlich frech.
Next, they choose the drinks. Frau Berger says she would like a mineral water, ein Mineralwasser. Listen to the conversation.
Ja, und was möchten Sie trinken?
Ein Mineralwasser. Und Sie?
Ein Bier.
Und Ihre zweite Stimme?
Einen Orangensaft.
Sei doch endlich still.
Ziemlich frech, Ihre zweite Stimme.
Also, ich bestelle jetzt mal.
Andreas says he'd like to have a beer. At this point, Frau Berger can't resist asking what his other voice, Stimme, which is of course X, would like to drink. "What about your second voice?" she says.
Und Ihre zweite Stimme?
X replies at once, "An orange juice."
Einen Orangensaft.
Andreas is beginning to feel very uncomfortable, and he says to X, "Do be quiet."
Sei doch endlich still.
Frau Berger thinks Andreas is putting on a funny voice and says, "Rather cheeky, your second voice."
Ziemlich frech, Ihre zweite Stimme.
Andreas tries to distract Frau Berger's attention by saying, "Well, I'm ready to order now."
Also, ich bestelle jetzt mal.
In the last lesson, Andreas, Frau Berger and X had a meal in an Italian restaurant. Frau Berger wanted to find out more about the strange voice she kept hearing whenever she spoke to Andreas.
Da ist sie ja wieder, Ihre zweite Stimme.
Frau Berger doesn't realize that the voice she hears belongs to X, because X is invisible. X was enjoying this game, and to make things even more confusing for Frau Berger, she ordered an orange juice.
Einen Orangensaft.
Andreas tried to ignore X and to distract Frau Berger's attention at the same time. The three of them are still at the restaurant and are about to pay the bill. Frau Berger doesn't think Andreas should pay for her because he doesn't have much money. Frau Berger pays for a salad, fish, and a mineral water. The waiter turns to Andreas and begins adding up the bill for his meal. Listen to the rest of the conversation. Andreas suddenly finds himself in an embarrassing situation. Andreas has forgotten his wallet, Geldbeutel. "It must be in my coat," he says.
Ich habe ihn sicher im Mantel.
Andreas rushes off to the cloakroom in search of his wallet. He apologizes to the waiter and asks him to wait a moment.
Einen Moment bitte.
X goes to the cloakroom with Andreas, and in a moment you'll discover why. Andreas suspects that X has something to do with the fact that his wallet is missing. First, listen to the conversation between Andreas and X. Is Andreas right in thinking X knows where his wallet is?
Hast du meinen Geldbeutel?
Nein, ich habe ihn nicht.
So ein Mist. Ich finde ihn nicht. Ex, hast du ihn wirklich nicht?
Wirklich nicht.
Aber wo ist er dann?
Im Hotel.
Und das sagst du erst jetzt? Du bist wirklich frech.
Sowieso.
X hasn't got Andreas's wallet, but she knows where it is. She saw him leave it behind in the hotel, but she didn't tell him. Listen once again. Andreas asks X if she has his wallet, Geldbeutel.
Hast du mein Geldbeutel?
X replies that she hasn't got it.
Nein, ich habe ihn nicht.
But Andreas can tell from X's tone of voice that she knows more than she's giving away. Listen once again.
Ich habe ihn nicht.
Andreas is annoyed. What a nuisance, he says.
So ein Mist.
Andreas thinks that X may be up to her usual tricks, so he asks her if she's sure she hasn't got it.
Ex, hast du ihn wirklich nicht?
He still thinks X knows something, but where is it then, he asks.
Aber wo ist er dann?
X can't hide the truth any longer, and she tells Andreas where it is.
Im Hotel.
Andreas is furious that X has kept this from him. He says, "And you're only telling me that now?"
Und das sagst du erst jetzt.
And he tells her that she really has a nerve.
Du bist wirklich frech.
X can't help agreeing and says, Andreas is obviously right.
Sowieso.
Dr. Thurman tells Andreas about the job he wants him to do. That's a long story, and you can find out more about that in the next part of the series. Meanwhile, Dr. Thurman tells Andreas to think it over.
Überlegen Sie noch mal.
And he gives him his telephone number, Telefonnummer, in Berlin.
Hier ist meine Telefonnummer.
Finally, he says to Andreas, "Call me in Berlin."
Rufen Sie mich in Berlin an.
X has been listening to the conversation between Andreas and Dr. Thurman. She says she'd like to come along, mitkommen, although Andreas hasn't yet made up his mind about going to Berlin. Listen now to the conversation between X and Andreas.
Ich komme mit.
Du möchtest mitkommen?
Ja, bitte. Bitte.
Mal sehen.
Weißt du noch? Interessant. Sehr interessant.
Stimmt. Stimmt genau.
Dr. Thurman tells Andreas about the job he has planned for him.
Überlegen Sie noch mal. Hier ist meine Telefonnummer. Rufen Sie mich in Berlin an.
Gut, ich rufe Sie an.
And of course X doesn't want to be left behind.
Ich komme mit.
Du möchtest mitkommen?
Ja, bitte. Bitte.
Mal sehen.
Weißt du noch? Interessant. Sehr interessant.
Stimmt. Stimmt genau.
Well, that brings us to the end of the first part of the language course, Deutsch, warum nicht? We hope you'll join us for the next part, in which you can find out more about the Hotel Europa in Aachen and about the job that Dr. Thurman has got lined up for Andreas in Berlin, assuming, of course, that Andreas decides to take Dr. Thurman up on his offer. So, until then, it's goodbye for now.
Auf Wiederhören.